things about grants. Okay. Okay, they just started the recording, so we'll start over. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. And now if I can get the screen back, okay. Today I'm going to talk about aspects of research applications that are beyond the research plan. And the thing to really think about here is that while when we think about grants and grantsmanship, we really think about the research plan as the most important bit. But for many grant opportunities, the parts of the application that aren't the research plan are equally important. And in many types of applications, such as F awards, the parts of the application that aren't the research plan are actually count more than the research plan itself. And that we tried to get a grants officer in today to kind of tag team with me. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to make it. So I hope that I will be able to give the point of view of the grants officers that are at your institutions. And because I can see this from both sides, I've written grants myself, but I also understand how difficult it can be if investigators don't do certain things, that it makes our grant administrator's job extraordinarily difficult. So in the ideal situation, you exhibit behaviors that both make it so you have the best application possible, and you allow the people whose job it is to help us get our grants and administrate our grants to be as effective as possible in their jobs. So that the non-research plan components of grant applications have two big purposes. The biggest one that really is generally as important to us is they let the reviewer know that you can actually carry out that work. And these include things such as environment, biosketch, budget and justification, as well as research compliance issues, because reviewers are asked to actually identify research compliance issues such as animal and human subjects and biosafety, as well as data sharing plans. However, the non-research plan components also allow our administrators to effectively keep track of our grant awards, help them collect the data necessary to provide to the people who provide the money. For instance, it allows the NIH to report to Congress what they're getting for the US tax dollars they're putting into the NIH budget. And they also allow for compliance with federal rules in procurement and other sorts of things. So both the non-research plan components do directly affect your score, as well as they allow our grants administrators to actually give us the money. Because if our research is not compliant with federal law or the rules of the granting agency, they can't give us a penny. And their job is to make sure that we're following the correct rules. So the thing that I want to emphasize, and that I really want to, and I can't say this too strongly, work on the non-research plan components when formulating your specific aims. In other words, start 2 months out if you can. Do not leave this for the last moment. I would say that the biggest mistake that investigators make, and this includes established investigators as well as new investigators, is that they are so focused on developing your research plan that they leave all of the auxiliary information to the last moment. The thing is that the auxiliary information is, if it's not done correctly, is the stuff that is either going to get your grant not submitted in the first place because it's not compliant with institutional rules, or once it's submitted, the grant will be basically removed from consideration because it does not fulfill the grant agency guidelines. Generally, these non-research components aren't intellectually difficult. However, they're often extremely time-consuming, depending on what sort of research plan you really have. So by using this as a break, like you're trying to brainstorm ideas into specific aims, you're brain dead. When you're brain dead is the time usually to work on the non-research plan components. Just get them done very far out, and particularly know exactly every piece of information you need to collect very far out. Now, this is, and apologize, this is kind of a dense slide, but why do you need this early start? That a really big one, and I bring this up because of this group of investigators. If you're working at an institution without a strong history of grant support or collaborating with such an institution, and the sorts of things you should think about are things such as small colleges, community health centers, public health organizations, and so forth, that they may not have the federal institutional compliance paperwork or numbers in place to allow them to be your collaborators on grant awards. If they don't have those numbers, you cannot submit the award, the application with them as institutional collaborators, particularly if they don't have some very simple things such as federal tax ID numbers or DINS numbers or other sorts of federal compliance numbers. That can take several months of lead time. So particularly if you're working with a small institution or a institution that has a very important outreach component, but may not have applied for specific federal grant support, make sure they have everything in place, because otherwise your grant will not be submitted. This happened to an investigator in my department. They were collaborating with some of the community-based organizations for cancer screening in Delaware, and the award required this to be a full collaboration where both organizations were considered awardees. And the grant did not get submitted for that deadline because this small community-based organization didn't have the right paperwork in place. Another piece that even if you're only working within your institution, let's say you're only working within Christiana Care, you're only working within Nemours or across, if you are collaborating with somebody who does not apply for grants regularly, it can be really, really difficult to get their biosketches and environment pages into compliant formats. In my personal world, I see this very much when one is collaborating with clinicians, because clinical collaborators can be very, very wonderful and extremely interested and excited, but they don't keep a NIH-style biosketch up to date at all times, particularly with the new biosketch formats that each biosketch has to be customized to the application. And that if you get somebody who doesn't know the rules, does not know how to put a biosketch together, just getting a clinician's time to get that together with you is really, really difficult. And one thing that I will point out is that especially those of you who are MRDA recipients, that I read all of your applications. Several of you submitted applications with collaborators or co-mentors that did not have NIH-compliant biosketches. We were able to review your application without that. However, if you then go forward and are going to apply for an actual NIH grant, you cannot do that. You have to get your mentors and collaborators' biosketches fully NIH compliant, i.e. following the rules. And really that requires a lot of text. Sometimes it requires you have to write it, but you have to interview the person to get the information, because often you cannot just pull it off of a CV because of the way these are formatted these days. And another piece that is important if you're, again, working with collaborators that haven't been applying for grants recently or have not been applying for NIH grants, let's say, that there is a number called there is something called an ERA Commons ID. Everybody who submits a grant has to have an ERA Commons ID. And later, if you get your award, every single person who works on the award needs an ERA Commons ID. This included an undergraduate researcher who's working in your lab for the summer. Now, this is a reasonably straightforward process, but it has to go through your grants office. And that, depending on the backlog at the grants office, you do not want to be asking for an ERA Commons ID at noon on the day that the grant is due. You need to get that done ahead of time. Also, some grants might require IACUC or IRB approvals at the time of application. Now, NIH has just-in-time rules where that they only ask for these approvals after they think they're going to be making an award. But that some grants require those approvals at the time of application. And these are seldom quick, even at the most research-intensive locations. At Delaware, I think it takes pretty much a minimum of 6 weeks. So you have to know what the rules are ahead of time. Also, you have to appreciate that staff and research compliance offices have heavy workloads that are very dependent on the time of the schedule. That this workload gets extreme during major grant deadlines because, for instance, the NIH June 6th deadline is coming up. That is the regular research award deadline. The University of Delaware Grants Office is going to have many, many people submitting grants for that deadline. That the people in the research office, their job is to help us make sure we're following the rules and everything's compliant. If you get your paperwork done weeks or a month ahead of time, they have time to carefully check all of your paperwork, to make sure your budget is right, to make sure that everything is right. So you want to make sure you get this advice, and to basically, you don't want your grant to be rejected before it's even hits peer review because it doesn't comply with the rules. I just gave a talk at Johns Hopkins yesterday, and I was talking to an investigator who had applied for an R21 award, which have a pretty standard budget, I believe, of $275,000 over the period of a grant. That in her case, though, she had submitted a similar grant for March of Dimes, which had a $200,000 budget, and to NIH, which had a $275,000. That everything was being done in a hurry, and the $200,000 March of Dimes budget went to the NIH. Now, while there is a standard $275,000 grant, they're only going to give you what you ask for. And she got a really good score, and they only gave her $200,000 because that's what she requested. She could not change that budget to the standard budget after the fact because the budget had already gone through peer review. So in that case, that she was doing stuff at the last minute, stuff wasn't double checked correctly, and she ended up losing $75,000 of direct grant funds simply because she did this deadline. She did her budget way, way too close to the deadline. And the last thing is just a very practical thing, is that as you get closer and closer to the deadline, you're getting people to read it, you might be getting last minute feedback. You do not want to spend your time the day or two before the deadline trying to, at the last minute, put together all of the other pages of the grant. You want to spend that time with final edits, final word crafting, making sure you did not incorporate anything into the research plan. This is human nature, and you don't want to be spending that last minute time on those final edits. If you get all your grant paperwork done and approved 2 weeks out, you don't have to worry about it then, okay? So starting early is the thing that is probably my largest piece of advice here. Now, when you're deciding to apply for a grant application, contact your department or institutional grants administrators. I typically recommend the first conversation should be happening 2 months out at a minimum. Particularly those of you who are working with collaborative research that's going among multiple institutions. This means that, for instance, let's say you're doing a multiple PI grant between an investigator at the University of Delaware and Nemours. Both grant offices have to be involved. Both grant offices have to approve the application, and everything has to go through 2 complete sets of bureaucracy. And the Delaware Grants Office has to communicate and negotiate with the Nemours Grants Office. So you have to make sure all of that is put together well. If there's a subcontract, either where you're subcontracting some work out to another institution, it's the same issue. Both research organizations have to agree. These negotiations cannot be happening near a grant deadline. And the thing to appreciate is if you're working with a non-research intensive institution, even longer lead times could be necessary. One, because they may not have a dedicated grant support staff. They may have to get things actually signed off by the vice president or the actual person who's the director of the institution because they don't have an institutional signing officer. So you really want to have a very good view of every piece of information you need to collect, because you need to comply with both grant and institutional rules. This also allows them to plan their workload to help you optimally for the reasons that I was saying, is that the grants officers need to know that you have a grant deadline, let's say on June 23rd. Well, guess what? That grants officer may decide to go on vacation on June 20th, right? So especially if you're in a small institution, that they're not going to be there to help you, or the person who's there as their substitute might not be as knowledgeable. So if they're going on vacation on June 20th and it's due the 23rd, if you have all your paperwork done ahead of time so that all you have to do is be doing the final edits on your research plan, often you will be given the information you need to push the button to submit the grant. Everything's good, everything is well crafted. If they don't know you want to submit a grant until June 19th, guess what? They can't help you because they're leaving town, okay? And this piece is you are unlikely to be able to directly submit your application. The thing that a lot of science, especially early career scientists, don't understand is that there are very, very few granting agencies that make grants to individuals. It doesn't matter you're the principal investigator, it's not your grant. It's the grant of your employer. So that the applications are actually the responsibility of your employer. They're as the final legal buck stops here. And like at the University of Delaware, we put all of our federal grant applications into a piece of software called Cayuse, that under normal circumstances, that actual submission to the agency has to be done in our research office. There are some circumstances where you can say, where they have decided everything is fine, you have uploaded a draft research plan, and they will say that, all right, we will allow you to actually push the submission button instead of their agency, but you're taking responsibility for pushing that submission button, but they only allow it after they've already approved all of the legal parts of the paperwork. So again, that's another reason to get it done ahead of time, so that if you want to be submitting at 4 o'clock on the day it's due, you can. Not that that's recommended, because grant servers tend to crash on the day of a grant application. And if you are doing your submission the day before or that morning, there's plenty of time to make the grant deadlines if servers are slow or crashing. You don't want to be uploading large documents to pretty much any submission grant server on the day the grant is due. Okay, so just an overall recommended timeline. Like I said, 2 months out, compile all the information needed and start collecting the information and writing the non-research plan components. This is also the same time period that ideally you have formulated your specific aims and are really starting to put your application together. I would highly recommend to you to have all non-research plan components drafted by 1 month out. This includes things such as written requests for reagents or collaborations. Very often, I'm a basic scientist, so I'll need a mouse to do an experiment, that I need to contact the person who has the mouse. I need to get a letter from them stating that they will give me the mouse, and I need to get their biosketch. Let's say somebody's going to help me learn a technique or bring it to my lab. Same deal. You don't want to be trying to collect these pieces of information far, 3 days ahead. You're going to miss your deadlines. If you do this and have all those requests out that you can anticipate a month out, you're going to be good to go, probably making your deadlines. Also, try to collect all necessary biosketches. Particularly as if you are a scientist working with clinical collaborators, or let's say the director of a health agency or a community health organization, that you should have the draft biosketches from them. And then you have to make sure and start editing them for compliance, making sure they are in fact in the format of the agency you're applying for. And I would say the goal is by 2 weeks out of the deadline, complete all non-research plan components written and submitted to your research office for primary review. This is a time when they will have some free time to actually start to go through things and make sure that that there's not mistakes in them. And this is also the time period you want to have your budget completely approved by your research office. Okay. So now I'm going to go through just some pieces of the application and some things that you want to consider as you're putting together pieces of the application that are not the research plan components. And I'm picking these as they're in the standard NIH grants, but they're also very, very common in a wide variety of applications. It's just the exact format can be a little bit different. So environment pages or environment and facilities. The purpose of this is to make the extent and quality of your dedicated research space as well as the research environment clear. These are the resources that strengthen your application, and they basically show that your institution is supportive of research. They are invested its resources towards your success. This is where you put together your space. If you're doing clinical things, this is where you talk about your support for biostatistics, institutional research coordinators, all of these sorts of things. Reviewers really look for this. They look for to make sure you have all the pieces in place and will mark down applications in which that investigator does not have the backing. Now, if you do any grant review or you see people's examples of environment pages, you will often see that these are very sketchy and poorly written. Now, to be perfectly frank, if you are an investigator at Harvard and you're working in a department that everybody knows is the top in the world in that area, you can get away with writing really, really badly put together environment pages. However, those of us who are through CTR, IMBRI, or Idea States, we typically are not in institutions that are well known or well recognized. So that don't be surprised if your reviewer does not know what Christiana Care is, or your reviewer does not know what Nemours is, or to be perfectly honest, even if your reviewer doesn't know what the University of Delaware is. Up until about 4 years ago, I was the only person in the entire state of Delaware who had funding from the National Eye Institute. Nobody who's reviewing my grants would have any idea what the institutional resources are here, because I was the only person in my area in the entire state. So it's crucial to write this specifically. Make it really, really clear what you have available to you in space, equipment, resources. This is where you can also really talk about your patient populations. If you're at Nemours, and you're doing clinical research, talk about exactly how many people come in the front door for treatment. What are the demographics of those patients? What are the demographics coming into your department in a clinical treatment setting? That they will, because your reviewers will not assume you have the resources or the environment you need to do your work. I've even seen investigators at much larger institutions run into problems with this sort of thing because, let's say you're studying a rare orphan disease, the reviewers may be skeptical that your clinic sees enough of that patient. And for instance, I know that Nemours has certain patient populations where the largest patient population in the world is seen here. Well, don't expect your reviewer to know that. You have to tell them that explicitly if you're studying one of those diseases. And overall, you must sell the idea that your proposed work can be done in your environment at the highest level, space, composition of your department. What do your colleagues look like? What sorts of people can you talk to work through problems? What are your resources, equipment, core facilities, again, patient populations? Now, there's this big tendency to just get canned boilerplates from other people in your institution. However, I can't emphasize enough that it can be extremely powerful to customize or elaborate on this for the strength of your environment directed to your research. Don't include resources that are not relevant to your research plan. For instance, if you're not writing a grant that has any need for bioinformatics support, don't tell them how wonderful the bioinformatics department is or what kind of support is there. Make sure and don't propose things in your research plan that you haven't specifically explained in your environment pages that you have adequate resources to do. They could be here, but the people reviewing your grant have no idea. You can't assume any prior knowledge, so you have to tell them explicitly. Okay, are we good here? I can stop for a minute. Any questions up to this moment? Yeah. Let's see. Why am I not taking down? Oh, I am stuck. There we go. All right, so the next piece that I'm going to talk about is Biosketches. Biosketches are probably the piece that in the past 2 or 3 years since NIH changed their Biosketch format, this is the place where grants are most likely to have compliance issues with actual format. That NIH style is probably going to be the most common Biosketch format you're going to have to be writing for this group of people. Both small foundations will often just say, give us an NIH Biosketch format. And of course, the NIH requests that as well. Now, the new NIH Biosketch, it really can't just be something that one keeps on hand and passes out to collaborators. Just the same way, if you're writing a grant, you can't just accept generic Biosketches. You have to make sure they're in the format that is going to be compliant. A really big place that a lot of people have trouble with is there's the section that is contributions to science. NIH Biosketches are no longer just lists of papers they've published in the past several years. You're expected to actually explain what things have you discovered since the beginning of your career and what are the most important things. This is a place where scientists are often uncomfortable tooting their own horn. They don't like to say what their contributions are, but the NIH Biosketch is a marketing document for your abilities. It really is not meant to resemble an academic CV. So you must sell your accomplishments. If you are very early career, that you might not have, I think it's 5 accomplishments if I remember correctly, but most people do. Even if you have to go back to your undergraduate research project, sell your accomplishments and your contributions to science. Try to come up with your 5. Now, the whole point of the reason NIH put this into place was to make it so that early career scientists weren't disadvantaged, or it also allowed for non-published contributions or science to be mentioned. So this is a place where if you've written manuals, you've written SOPs, you've done GenBank accessions, these are all things that you can talk about in your contributions to science. Even working out protocols that other people use to answer a scientific question. Now, keep in mind, these comments are only for early career investigators. If you're well established, you should focus on your peer-reviewed contributions, because presumably if you've been doing science and publishing for a while, you'll be able to talk about your contributions to science using peer-reviewed evidence. But if you're early career, don't leave this blank. I often will see early career investigators who have a long history of research experience only mention one contribution to science. That does not look good. If you've been doing research for 10 years and you can only mention one contribution to science, that does not make you sound like a strong investigator. Now, the tricky bit is to make sure that all submitted Biosketches comply with this format and are customized for the project. That the very first part of these Biosketches are an opening statement. This is a paragraph that says why your participation in that research is valuable for that project. For instance, if you are sending your Biosketch in for part of a training grant or to mentor a young investigator, this should talk about your mentoring experience. It should talk about why you were the right person to be this young investigator's mentor. It shouldn't just be saying, I am God's gift to science. God's gift to science does not make you a good mentor. So that first paragraph is explaining why you are the best possible mentor for that individual. If you're sending a biosketch in that's a collaboration, later on this person may have 5 contributions to science, but the reason they're your valuable collaborator is because they have one experience in a technique or in a approach. That opening paragraph, that's what it should be highlighting. So that's just what I mean, is that submitted biosketches must be concordant with the application and they should be customized for the project. So this is really important. It's a sign that your collaboration is real and the collaborator is engaged. For mentored awards, having the biosketch match the application and really sell why that's the best mentor in that paragraph is saying that your collaborator and mentor's engaged in your success. So it's crucial to give adequate time to get these appropriately edited. Because the first thing, if you ask somebody for their biosketch, they'll just send you the last biosketch they wrote or the last biosketch they sent in with their grant. But that is not, it's either not going to be in a compliant format because it's too old, or it's going to have that paragraph selling their expertise for something unrelated to you. That has to be written specifically for your project. And like I said earlier, many of the CTR pilot and MRDA applications fail to do this. This is something where you weren't dinged for it when you applied for these internal grants. You must fix this for external applications. It does not make the collaboration look strong to put together a biosketch that does not match the rest of the application. Okay. So a couple other things that I just want to mention is that under your contributions to science, very often the very first thing you should be saying is that over the course of my career, I have published whatever the number of total publications. And it doesn't hurt to include this both in your personal statement and your contributions to science sections, that this will help the reviewer know that that you have been productive in your field. And keep in mind that just because you're published in Famous, you feel you're published in Famous, it doesn't mean the study section member has any idea who you are. This is less of a problem such as in my field because we are a very small community. So most of the reviewers are going to know who the applicants are. But it's a big problem in really big fields, let's say cancer, diabetes, or cardiovascular research. You may be getting knowledgeable reviewers who don't know who you are. Now, this piece is also part of the NIH Biosketch, and it's also the reason that this is so important to do ahead of time. That the current NIH Biosketch has the ability to add a link to My Bibliography. Now, My Bibliography is something that the National Library of Medicine has. It allows you to curate all of your publications from PubMed accession numbers as well as from other sources. That this is actually where you put your full academic CV of publications is into the My Bibliography link. Now, once you've been a scientist for a long time, this is cross-referenced with the progress on your grants, and it's considered the official list of the publications that are the progress to your prior grant awards. However, even as a young investigator, you need to have this put in place. That this can take a while to get set up. It's not necessarily the most intuitive to put together. And this, to be perfectly honest, that many grant reviewers do not read the current NIH Biosketch. They hate it because they think it's a marketing document, which it is. The only thing they look at is they want to click onto the My Bibliography link and look at all the things this person has published and what years and where they published them. So having this accurate and in place is really, really important. Now, this can be a nightmare if you're, let's say, trying to put together a grant with a clinician that's been publishing all along, but might not necessarily be NIH funded, because they could have 50 publications that have never been compiled into a My Bibliography on the National Library of Medicine site. That before you submit, you have to get that clinical collaborator to get their My Bibliography set up so that when you include their biosketch, that they will be clear to the reviewer that they're a valuable collaborator. And the other reason this can take a lot of time is that, let's say that you were asked to be the principal investigator on an infrastructure or an instrumentation grant. That everybody who publishes a paper with your instrumentation grant puts that grant on their papers. That feeds back into the My Bibliography site, and every single paper published from that piece of common instrumentation gets dumped into your My Bibliography, which you have to go in and hide those contributions so that when they link, you're not irritating the reviewer with 50 papers that you're not an author on that are because of progress for a major instrumentation award. So this is extremely important. You will not be able to get this accomplished 2 days out especially if you have clinical collaborators. But even for yourself, it's not going to be an easy thing to do at the last minute. Also, just as a general rule, don't place in preparation or submitted papers on your biosketch. This is considered by most reviewers an attempt to inflate your progress, and it's against NIH rules. However, there is a gray area here, and it's unclear how this is going to play out. NIH, within the past month, just changed their policy to allow inclusion of intermediate research products. Now, intermediate research products could be, are basically code for preprints. Now, preprints aren't all that common in biomedical research right now, but they are very, very common in other fields such as physics. So now you can write a paper and submit it to a preprint server and have a link to that. The upside is that if people want to go and read this stuff, they can click through to it. It's unclear how reviewers will really okay, sorry, we have an announcement here.
Code pink, the missing child.
Okay.
She's wearing flowered pants.
Okay. So we don't have any flowered pants here, so we're good. So so how this is all going to be viewed, I wouldn't necessarily consider this an unalloyed good. It's unclear how preprints are going to actually play out in medical research in particular. But this is a place where a submitted or in preparation paper can't be put on your biosketch. But if you have written something and put it on a preprint server, you can mention it. Whether it will help your case at all, that's not clear at all right now, though. So I would probably recommend holding off until it's clear how this is going to play out. Okay. Now, the last piece of the Biosketch section is the research support session. And I'm mentioning this because this group are young investigators. The research support section basically says to give any grants that you've had within the past 3 years. However, one thing that I recommend, especially if you're an assistant professor who received a fairly significant startup package, this is a place where you can actually mention your startup package. If you're a newly independent assistant professor, it actually is a big plus to your reviewers that you received a startup package for your lab, equipment, money, whatever, even list how much it is there. Because that people really want to see young investigators be independent investigators. That startup package is the institutional commitment to support your independence. That gets weighted a lot more than somebody who has a research assistant professor position on paper, but is really a glorified postdoc who has no independent space or money. The person with the startup package is definitely going to get a boost in the new investigator game. that you definitely want to list any current funding or know that you will get. Let's say you've gotten a pre-award document. And then the requirement is to include all funding within 3 years, but under certain circumstances, you might want to include older grants if you want to show a longer history. It's not actually precluded from doing that. Okay? So any questions right now on Biosketches? Okay. All right. So the next bit is I'm going to talk about is budget and its justification. Nope, sorry. Okay. Okay. So the child was found. So we're good. All right. So for the budget and its justification, that this is your listing of how much money you're asking for, along with specifics of why you need it. All NIH applications need specific justification for staff and their duties with percent effort. And this is no matter what the mechanism, whether it's modular or not. If you're applying for a non-modular NIH grant, as well as most other grant mechanisms, all of your costs need explicit justification. And now this is the piece that the institutional grants officers are going to be extremely interested in, because this is basically the part that they're legally obligated to monitor and maintain. This is also, keep in mind that as investigators, we usually just think of the direct cost budgets, but that there are also indirect cost budgets, and not all indirect costs are considered equal. Not everything you ask for in your direct budget will actually be charged the same rate of indirect costs. For instance, a piece of equipment over $5,000, there's no indirect cost for that. If you're asking for tuition for a graduate student, that doesn't actually charge indirect costs either. So sometimes, depending on what you've asked for in your budget, the indirect cost calculations can be quite tricky. And your budget officer needs adequate time to make sure that your budget is, in fact, fully compliant. Now, some things that that's one thing you want to remember is that reviewers are always asked to cut money from grants. That's very, so when the reviewer is looking at your grant, they're asked to say, is the amount of money being asked for actually reasonable to allow is this what they need to get the work done? If the reviewer thinks you're asking for much more than is reasonable, they absolutely will recommend cuts. And at NIH, they can ask for cuts in time and cuts in amount. So amount is that they think your yearly budget is inflated. Time is that they don't think it's going to take, let's say, 5 years to do the same project. However, another mistake that people make is that they think, oh, if I can put in a research proposal and I ask for less money, I have a better chance of getting funded. However, this is a very dangerous game to play. Do not lowball your budget. One thing that can happen is if you lowball your budget and the reviewer says there's no way in the world they can do this science for this amount of money, the reviewer will lose confidence in your ability to get it done. You will appear naive, and they are judging in the end, can you get the grant done? If you're asking for too little money to get it done, your score just got dropped. Now, the thing to remember is that NIH still will happily cut budgets recommended for time and amount, and still expect you to do the proposed research. So just because you've lowballed the budget doesn't guarantee that NIH won't cut that budget further. So ask for what you need, make sure what you've asked for is well justified, and just hope for the best. But the budgets of grants are not a review criteria. So low budgets will not help you get funded for sure. If anything, they'll hurt you. Okay. Now, so those are the sort of environment pages, biosketches, budgets. Those are things that reviewers look at very carefully. Now, the next pieces are more compliance issues, but if you don't play the compliance game right, that reviewers are asked to look at your grant for compliance, you want to very much avoid having any compliance issues flagged by reviewers, because if compliance is looked at by the program people making the funding decision, it is way harder to demonstrate compliance at that stage than it is at the time of application. And the first one, which is going to be important for many of you on this call, is the human subjects piece. This is, for clinical research, the human subjects section can make or break a grant. Even though it is not what's called a scorable criteria, that if you don't write your human subjects pages correctly, this can directly affect the reviewer's opinion of your research plan. They are looking for strong evidence. You have considered fully the challenges of identifying significant numbers of subjects to obtain statistically relevant data, and you have overcome these challenges. So in this human subjects thing, you really have to describe that your subject population. Is it large enough? Will it have appropriate racial, age, and gender diversity? Is that gender, age, and race, age, and gender diversity actually large enough to be able to make statements about these sorts of things? If your study population does not represent a full diversity of the population, you have to explicitly state it, and don't be afraid to be too obvious here. Is that if you're studying prostate cancer, state why it does not include women, especially with the new rules on making sure your study populations take into account gender issues, that if it's not including women, you state that prostate cancer does not affect women. Similarly, if you're doing research on Alzheimer's disease, you need to explain why your study population is not including children, because sometimes you just can't be too obvious. You also want to make sure your sample sizes are fully justified biostatistically. And if you're doing human work, you must give power analyses. So this is a place where you really have to make sure you are consulting your biostatistics help and biostatistics course. Finally, if your research is exempt or considered not human, you should still include the justification for this determination. Now, of course, if you're not using the word human at all in your grant and you're studying C. elegans, you just say not applicable. However, if you're studying a human cell lines or cadaver tissue, which also are considered not human research, it's always good to state that in this human subject session, and to even quote the regulation that states that. If the human subjects research, let's say you're doing certain kinds of social science surveys, if you're exempt because you're using de-identified tissue from surgeries, etc., that you need to fill out the human subject stuff, and you need to explicitly state why it's exempt from IRB regulation and give the regulation. That the thing you have to understand is that grant reviewers are asked whether or not your application is fully compliant with human subjects rules, but the grant reviewers who are doing that assessment might not be 100% familiar with the rules of the exemptions and when is research not human. So if you just put that out here in this section, then you don't have to worry about your grant ever being flagged. Sometimes a half an hour of effort here can save you days of work if something gets flagged and having to deal with bureaucratic hoops later. Similarly, for animal subjects, that you want to make sure that you put enough information here so it doesn't get flagged by the study section. You want to have your detailed description of the animals. You really need to remember here that NIH now requires that animals of both sexes be used in studies. Just stating that females give more variable results is not sufficient or acceptable justification for including them from your study. So that if you are only using males, that could be because you're studying a male-specific disease. Same way with if you're only using females. But if you're doing something that should affect males and females both, you can't just use male mice for this. That you need to specifically justify why you're doing animal research. Now, you need to include all of the numbers of animals that will be generated but not used directly in the study. Because very often people who are doing genetically modified animal research only include the animals that they need to do the study. But keep in mind, very often there's a lot of animals generated of the incorrect genotype. Those have to be included in your total numbers. You need to talk about minimizing pain and distress, and you also need to talk about euthanasia guidelines. Any kind of thing that this is flagged by a reviewer and you need to worry about IACUC issues at the level of program, the review is much more rigorous if it's flagged at the level of the primary grant review. Now, be specific as you answer these questions. This is a piece you absolutely do not wait to the last minute. I have been reviewing grant applications for over 15 years. I cannot tell you the number of times when somebody took an animal subject section from another grant and just stuck it in their grant at the last minute. They're clearly lifted from another application because the name of the mutant studied doesn't match the application. That the experiments to be performed, key experiments in the application to be performed aren't in the section that's with the grant. There's experiments mentioned that aren't being done in the research plan. It's really, really important to make sure that you aren't trying to do this at the last minute and lifting stuff without editing it for consistency. This is the fastest way that a section gets flagged by reviewers. And it can even prevent you from getting an award because of the timing involved in things. You might not be able to clarify all of the issues in time for when they have to actually make the award. And this will absolutely kill your grant if these compliance sections are not matching your actual grant application. It seems really simple, but I mean, just recently I reviewed F awards and there was an animal subject section with the wrong mutants in it. Okay, now as I talk about human and animal subjects, I want to bring up the NIH concept called just-in-time information. Just-in-time information is that this was put into place about 20 years ago. And the idea is that there was certain information that was only going to be requested if it looked likely that a grant was likely to be funded. And a really big piece of just-in-time information is IRB and IACUC approvals for your research. So you can submit a grant and you don't have to actually apply to the IRB or IACUC at that time of submission. You can just write pending. And that's okay. But keep in mind that that is the delay from, like, a grant submitted June 5th will be reviewed in September. The requests for just-in-time information may be coming through anywhere between October and January, depending on when funding decisions are being made. That what you don't want to do is get a good grant score. They ask you for just-in-time information, and then you have to wait through an entire IRB or IACUC review process. And while this is tempting because it's a lot of work, I would recommend you don't do it, particularly if you're under an IRB or an IACUC known to be slow or very, very picky. They might only meet once a month. They might be really, really sticklers for the way things are written. You don't want to lose an award due to issues with your regulatory approvals. So if you have approval at the time of submission, go ahead and include the number. But it's usually, if you've submitted a grant, this is a project you want to do anyway. Get the IRB in progress, get the IACUC in progress, because that, I'll use as an example, there are grants that are often funded with the last money in a fiscal year. They have to send out the award letter before, like NIH, if they're going to be funding within a fiscal year, they have to send out award letters by September 30th. If they send you just-in-time information August 1st, and you don't have those numbers in place by September 30th, they can't fund you, and they may not have money in their budget the next year. So this is a reason that be really careful about delaying too much, about getting IRB and IACUC approvals. Now, just a couple other grant sections to ignore at your peril, because they are also pieces that are flagged. NIH grants require resource and data sharing plans. These are if you make any resources available to the scientific community or collect a lot of data. So resources could be genetically modified animals, antibodies, constructs, or lots of amounts of data, genome sequencing data, very large clinical data sets. You're obligated to share these resources and make the data publicly available. So you are obligated to, so you should probably, most institutions have a boilerplate that includes the legal aspects of data and resource transfer, but it's best to customize this to the project. Most reviewers don't really care about how detailed this is or really even what it says, but you have to include it. If it is not there, the reviewers are obligated to flag your grant. And that, again, flag grants sometimes don't get funded, even if there's a good score. Also, biosafety. This is another section that many applicants ignore to their peril. This is not just for people who study Ebola. If you're working at biosafety level 2 or above, think human tissue and blood, lentiviruses, retroviral vectors, human clinical material. This section is required about how you're going to handle biosafety issues related to your work. So with that, I think it's 1 o'clock, so I'm done. I'll be happy to take questions, but if anything, I think the take-home message is here, don't leave this stuff to the last minute. There is great peace of mind to be had having all of the grant done except the research plan 2 weeks out from the deadline, because then you can just fully focus and concentrate on writing the very best science you can. Okay. So with that, if there's any questions, I can take them now. This out. And I thank everybody very much. And if there's any questions you just want to ask offline too, feel free to email me as usual. Okay. Thank you very much. I think Erin can stop recording.